Don Valentine. The Silicon Valley godfather who saw tomorrow. September 1999. The dot-com bubble was reaching its manic peak. Every venture capitalist in Silicon Valley was funding e-commerce clones, banner ad businesses, and eyeball accumulation strategies with no business models whatsoever. Money was flowing like water into anything with a .com at the end of its name. Valuations had lost all connection to reality. Common sense had left the building. Don Valentine sat in his Menlo Park office reading a business plan from two Stanford PhD students who wanted to build a search engine. They had no revenue model. They had no idea how to monetize their technology. The market looked completely saturated with competitors like AltaVista, Yahoo, Excite, and Lycos already dominating the space. Everyone Valentine respected in the industry thought search was solved. It's just a feature, not a business, they told him. Why would anyone invest in another search engine now? But Valentine saw something different. He pulled out a legal pad and wrote one sentence. The best product in a huge market always wins, even without a business model. This wasn't guesswork or gambling. It was a framework he had refined over 25 years of investing, from Apple to Cisco to Oracle. He had seen this pattern before. Exceptional founders building something 10 times better than the alternatives available in the market. He would invest $12.5 million in Google at a $250 million valuation. That investment would return $4.3 billion, a 216 times return over 11 years. But this moment reveals more than just one great investment. It reveals a system, a way of seeing that allowed Valentine to identify Apple in 1978, Cisco in 1987, and Google in 1999, while others chased consensus and followed the herd. What made Don Valentine different wasn't luck. It wasn't being in the right place at the right time. It was a systematic approach to pattern recognition that he developed over decades. An ability to see founding teams that others dismissed. A willingness to back companies in markets that didn't yet exist. A conviction that great products would find their business models eventually. And most importantly, an understanding that the quality of the entrepreneur mattered more than the quality of the business plan. This is the story of how one man helped create the modern technology industry. How he built Sequoia Capital into one of the most successful venture capital firms in history. How he saw patterns that others missed and backed founders that others rejected. And how his approach to investing created a template that venture capitalists still follow today. This is the story of Don Valentine. Don Valentine was born on May 1, 1932 in Ossining, New York. The world he entered was dramatically different from the one he would help create. America was in the depths of the Great Depression. Unemployment stood at 24%. Banks were failing across the country. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. The stock market had collapsed and wouldn't recover for decades. His parents, Donald and Catherine Valentine, were working-class Irish Catholics trying to survive the worst economic crisis in American history. His father worked as a lineman for Consolidated Edison, climbing utility poles to maintain electrical lines in all weather conditions. It was dangerous, physically demanding work that paid modest wages even in good times. During the Depression, the family was grateful just to have steady employment when millions had nothing. The Valentine family lived in a small house in Ossining, a Hudson River town best known for Sing Sing Prison. It was a tight-knit working-class community where neighbors knew each other and families stuck together through hard times. The neighborhood was predominantly Irish and Italian immigrant families, all struggling to make ends meet while maintaining their dignity and sense of community. Young Don grew up watching his father leave before dawn and return after dark, his hands calloused and scarred from decades of physical labor. His mother Catherine managed the household budget with fierce discipline, stretching every dollar as far as it would go. There was no money for luxuries or extras. Every penny had to count. The family ate simple meals, wore clothes until they couldn't be repaired anymore, and never wasted anything. This environment shaped Don Valentine in profound ways. He learned that security came from hard work, not inheritance or connections. He saw that economic volatility could destroy families and that having skills and value to offer was the only protection against uncertainty. He absorbed the immigrant work ethic that said you earned your place through contribution, not entitlement. And he developed a deep skepticism of risk without reward, speculation without substance. But there was something else in Don Valentine's childhood that would prove equally important. He was intellectually curious in ways that went beyond his environment. While other kids in the neighborhood were content with factory work or union jobs like their fathers, Don wanted to understand how things worked. He asked questions constantly. He read everything he could find. He was fascinated by how businesses operated and how money moved through the economy. His parents noticed this difference. They saw that their son had capabilities that could take him beyond the world they knew. Catherine Valentine in particular encouraged Don's education, even when money was impossibly tight. She believed that education was the ladder out of working-class struggle. That knowledge and skills could provide the security that physical labor never quite could. Don attended local public schools where he was a solid but not spectacular student. He wasn't the smartest kid in class or the most naturally gifted. But he had something more valuable than raw intelligence. He had focus and determination. He had the ability to work harder than anyone else when something interested him. And he was developing a practical, analytical mind that could cut through complexity to find the essential truth underneath. In high school, Don discovered he had a particular talent for understanding how systems worked. Whether it was mechanical systems, organizational systems, or business systems, he could see the structure underneath the surface. He could identify the key drivers and critical variables. He could understand cause and effect relationships that others missed. This systematic thinking would become his greatest asset as an investor decades later. After high school, Don Valentine enlisted in the United States Navy. This was 1950, and the Korean War had just begun. For a working-class kid from Ossining with no family money and uncertain job prospects, military service offered structure, training, and the GI Bill benefits that could fund college education afterward. It was a practical decision, not a patriotic impulse. Valentine served as an electronics technician, working on radar and communication systems aboard Navy ships. This was the early era of electronics, when vacuum tubes were giving way to transistors and the foundations of the computer age were being laid. Valentine found the work fascinating. He loved understanding how electronic circuits processed information, how signals moved through systems, how technology could solve problems that human effort alone couldn't address. The Navy gave Valentine more than technical training. It gave him discipline and systematic thinking. The military doesn't tolerate sloppiness or guesswork. Systems have to work reliably under stress. Procedures have to be followed precisely. There's no room for wishful thinking or self-deception. Either the equipment works or it doesn't. Either you understand the system or you don't. This rigorous, systematic approach to problem solving became fundamental to how Valentine would later evaluate companies and founders. He had no patience for hand-waving or vague promises. He wanted to understand the mechanics. What exactly was the product? How exactly did it work? Who exactly was the customer? What exactly was the competitive advantage? Precision mattered. Clarity mattered. Reality mattered. After his Navy service ended in 1954, Valentine used his GI Bill benefits to attend Fordham University in New York City. He studied electrical engineering, building on the technical foundation he developed in the military. Fordham was a Jesuit institution known for rigorous academics and moral seriousness. The Jesuits taught students to think clearly, argue logically, and question assumptions. They emphasized discipline of mind and character. Valentine thrived in this environment. Engineering suited his analytical mind and practical orientation. He wasn't interested in abstract theory for its own sake. He wanted to understand how to build things that worked in the real world. How to solve actual problems with practical solutions. How to create value through technical innovation. But Valentine's education went beyond engineering coursework. He was learning about business and finance by reading voraciously on his own. He studied how companies were built, how capital was raised and deployed, How markets worked and businesses competed. He was developing frameworks for understanding commercial reality that would serve him throughout his career. He graduated from Fordham in 1958 with his electrical engineering degree. At 26 years old, he was ready to enter the workforce with technical skills, systematic thinking, and a hunger to understand how technology and business intersected. He had no idea he was about to enter an industry at exactly the right moment, just as the semiconductor revolution was beginning to transform everything. Valentine's first job after college was at Sylvania Electric Products, a major electronics manufacturer based in New York. He worked in their semiconductor division, which was one of the early companies trying to commercialize the transistor technology that Bell Labs had invented in 1947. This was still the very early days of the semiconductor industry. Most electronics still used vacuum tubes. Transistors were expensive and their applications were limited. But Valentine saw immediately that transistors would change everything. They were smaller, more reliable, used less power, and generated less heat than vacuum tubes. As manufacturing improved and costs fell, transistors would enable entirely new categories of electronic products. The implications were enormous. This was a genuine technological revolution in its earliest stages. Working at Sylvania gave Valentine his first exposure to how technology companies operated. He learned about product development cycles, manufacturing processes, quality control, and customer relationships. He saw how technical innovation had to be combined with commercial viability to create successful products. He understood that great technology alone wasn't enough. You needed customers who would pay for it and manufacturing capability to deliver it at scale. In 1960, Valentine made a pivotal career move. He joined Fairchild Semiconductor in Palo Alto, California. This decision would change his life completely. Fairchild was the most important technology company of the 1960s, the company that essentially created Silicon Valley as we know it today. Founded in 1957 by the famous traitorous 8 who had left William Shockley's laboratory, Fairchild was pioneering the integrated circuit and training the generation of entrepreneurs who would build the semiconductor industry. Valentine arrived at Fairchild as a sales engineer, responsible for helping customers understand and implement semiconductor technology in their products. This role was perfect for Valentine's combination of technical knowledge and practical business sense. He could talk to engineers about technical specifications while also understanding the commercial realities customers faced. He became exceptionally good at identifying customer needs and figuring out how Fairchild's products could solve real problems. Working at Fairchild in the early 1960s was like getting a PhD in how the technology industry actually worked. Valentine was surrounded by brilliant engineers and aggressive entrepreneurs. He watched how Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore led the company. He saw how technical innovation created market opportunities. He observed how fast-moving companies could disrupt established competitors. He learned the dynamics of the semiconductor business, from design to manufacturing to sales. But Valentine was learning something even more important than semiconductor technology. He was learning how to evaluate people. In sales, you spend your time with customers, partners, and internal teams. You develop a sense for who is competent and who is bluffing. Who delivers and who makes excuses. Who has vision and who is just riding the wave. Valentine was developing pattern recognition skills around human capability that would become his greatest asset as a venture capitalist. By the mid-1960s, Valentine had become one of Fairchild's top sales executives. He was known for his direct, no-nonsense style. He didn't schmooze or play political games. He focused on understanding customer needs and delivering solutions. He built relationships based on competence and reliability, not charm or flattery. Customers trusted him because he never overpromised and always delivered what he said he would. In 1967, Valentine made another significant move. He joined National Semiconductor as Director of Sales and Marketing. National was founded by several Fairchild alumni and was trying to compete with its former parent company. This was Valentine's first real management role, responsible for building and leading a sales organization from the ground up. At National Semiconductor, Valentine learned how to build organizations and develop talent. He hired salespeople, trained them, set up compensation structures, and created systems for managing complex sales processes. He was good at this work because he understood that sales, like engineering, was a systematic process. It wasn't about personality or luck. It was about understanding customer needs, positioning products effectively, and executing consistently. But more importantly, Valentine was now working closely with founders and executives who were building a company from scratch. He saw how early-stage companies made decisions with limited resources and incomplete information. He watched how founders allocated capital between product development, manufacturing, and sales. He observed which strategies worked and which failed. He was getting an education in entrepreneurship that few people ever receive. Valentine stayed at National Semiconductor for 5 years, from 1967 to 1972. During this time, the company grew from a small startup to a significant player in the semiconductor industry. Valentine's sales organization was a key driver of that growth. He had proven he could not only sell products but build the organizational infrastructure needed for a technology company to scale. By 1972, Valentine had spent 12 years in the semiconductor industry. He had worked at 3 of the most important companies of that era. He understood the technology deeply. He knew the customer base intimately. He had relationships throughout the industry. And he had watched dozens of startups succeed and fail, learning lessons from each one. He was 40 years old and ready for something new. Capital Group, a major investment firm, recruited Valentine to become a venture capitalist. This was still early in the history of venture capital as an industry. The famous firms like Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia didn't exist yet. Most venture capital was done by wealthy individuals or small partnerships associated with investment banks. It was an emerging field without established rules or best practices. Valentine spent 2 years at Capital Group learning the business of venture capital. He invested in early-stage technology companies, served on boards, and helped entrepreneurs build their businesses. But he quickly realized that most venture capitalists didn't really understand technology companies the way he did. They looked at financial projections and market size estimates. They asked about revenue models and exit strategies. They were financial people trying to evaluate technology investments. Valentine knew there was a different and better way. He understood that in early-stage technology companies, the quality of the team mattered more than the quality of the spreadsheet. That the capability of the founders to execute was more important than the cleverness of the business plan. That great products would find their markets even without perfect initial strategies. He had watched this pattern play out dozens of times at Fairchild and National Semiconductor. In 1972, Valentine made the decision that would define his career. He would start his own venture capital firm focused exclusively on technology companies. He would build a firm that understood what technology entrepreneurs actually needed. That could help companies with more than just money. That brought real operational expertise to early-stage investing. He would do venture capital the way he thought it should be done. But starting a new venture capital firm required capital to invest. Valentine needed to raise a fund from limited partners who would trust him with their money. This was challenging because Valentine had no track record as a venture investor. He had worked in the industry and made a few investments at Capital Group, but he hadn't built a portfolio or generated returns yet. He was asking people to bet on his judgment and his approach. Valentine pitched potential limited partners with characteristic directness. He told them he would focus exclusively on semiconductor and computer companies in Silicon Valley. He would only invest in founding teams he believed could build exceptional companies. He would take concentrated positions rather than spreading capital across many small bets. He would work closely with portfolio companies to help them succeed. And he would be patient, willing to hold investments for many years if necessary. The pitch worked. Valentine raised $3 million for his first fund in 1972. By today's standards, that's a tiny amount of money. But in 1972, it was enough capital to make meaningful investments in early-stage technology companies. Valentine named his new firm Sequoia Capital, after the giant trees native to California. The name suggested patience, longevity, and natural strength. These were the qualities Valentine wanted his firm to embody. Valentine set up Sequoia's office in Menlo Park, right in the heart of what was becoming Silicon Valley. The location was strategic. He wanted to be close to Stanford University, which was producing many of the entrepreneurs and technologists driving the industry. He wanted to be near the companies he would invest in so he could work closely with their teams. And he wanted to be part of the emerging ecosystem of entrepreneurs, engineers, and investors building the future. The timing was perfect even though Valentine didn't know it yet. The personal computer revolution was about to begin. The networking revolution would follow. The internet revolution would come after that. Over the next 4 decades, wave after wave of technological innovation would create trillion-dollar markets and transform human society. Valentine was positioning himself at the center of it all. But in 1972, none of this was obvious. Most people thought computers were massive machines that only large corporations and governments could afford. The idea that normal people would have computers in their homes seemed absurd. The internet didn't exist. Email didn't exist. Software as an industry barely existed. The world that Valentine would help create was unimaginable to most people. Valentine's approach to venture capital was radically different from what other investors were doing. Most VCs at the time focused heavily on business plans and financial projections. They wanted to see detailed market analysis, competitive positioning, and 5-year revenue forecasts. They evaluated investments like they were buying shares in public companies, looking for financial metrics and growth rates. Valentine thought this approach was backwards for early-stage technology companies. He believed you couldn't predict the future with spreadsheets. Markets didn't exist yet for most of the technologies being invented. Competitive dynamics would change as technologies evolved. Revenue forecasts for companies with no revenue were just guesses. Financial analysis was essentially meaningless when everything was uncertain. Instead, Valentine focused almost entirely on the founding team. He wanted to understand who these people were. What drove them? What they had already accomplished. Whether they had the technical capability to build what they said they would build. Whether they had the hunger and determination to overcome inevitable obstacles. Whether they could attract and manage talented people. Whether they could adapt as circumstances changed. Valentine developed a systematic approach to evaluating founders. He looked for missionary intensity, a term he coined to describe founders who were obsessed with solving a problem or building a product, not just making money. He wanted to see evidence of exceptional capability, usually demonstrated through previous accomplishments. He looked for founders who could articulate their vision clearly and compellingly. And he wanted founding teams with complementary skills and genuine respect for each other. The business itself mattered too, but in a different way than other investors considered. Valentine asked fundamental questions. Is this a real problem that real customers will pay to solve? Is the technology genuinely differentiated or just incrementally better? Is the market large enough to support a significant company? Can this team actually build and deliver the product? These were practical, operational questions, not financial modeling exercises. Valentine also had a contrarian view about market size. Most investors wanted to see large existing markets with proven demand. Valentine preferred companies attacking markets that didn't exist yet but could become massive. He believed that the biggest opportunities came from creating new markets, not competing in established ones. This meant being willing to invest before market size was clear or provable. This approach required patience and conviction. You had to be willing to look wrong for years while markets developed and technologies matured. You had to resist pressure to chase consensus opportunities that everyone else was funding. You had to trust your judgment about people and technology even when financial metrics didn't support the investment yet. This was psychologically difficult and rare among investors. Valentine's first major investment at Sequoia came in 1974 when he backed a small semiconductor company called Linear Technology. The founder, Bob Swanson, had worked with Valentine at National Semiconductor. Valentine knew Swanson was an exceptionally capable engineer and manager. Linear Technology was developing analog integrated circuits for industrial and automotive applications. This was not a sexy market. Most investors were more interested in digital semiconductors and consumer applications. But Valentine saw several advantages. The market was large and growing as electronics penetrated more industries. The competition was fragmented and not particularly sophisticated. Swanson had genuine technical differentiation in his circuit designs. And Valentine knew from experience that industrial customers valued reliability and performance over low cost, which meant good profit margins for companies that delivered quality. Valentine invested $300,000 in linear technology in 1974. The company grew steadily, executing consistently in an unglamorous but profitable market niche. Linear Technology went public in 1986 and became one of the most successful semiconductor companies of its era. Valentine's initial investment eventually generated more than $100 million in returns. This was a huge success by any measure. But the Linear Technology investment revealed something important about Valentine's approach. He was willing to invest in companies that didn't fit the prevailing narrative about what was exciting or transformative. He focused on fundamentals like market opportunity, technical capability, and management quality. He was patient enough to let businesses compound value over many years. And he had the conviction to back people he believed in even when their markets weren't fashionable. Valentine's next major investment would be much more visible and would help establish Sequoia's reputation as the premier venture firm in Silicon Valley. In 1977, a young entrepreneur named Steve Jobs came to Valentine looking for funding. Jobs and his partner Steve Wozniak had built a primitive personal computer in Jobs' garage. They called it the Apple I. They were selling these computers to hobbyists through mail order and local computer stores. Jobs was 22 years old, had dropped out of college, and had no business experience whatsoever. He had long hair, wore sandals, and had just returned from a spiritual quest to India. By conventional standards, he was completely unbankable. Most serious venture capitalists wouldn't have taken a meeting with him. But Jobs had been introduced to Valentine through Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, where Jobs had worked. Valentine respected Bushnell and agreed to meet Jobs. The meeting did not go well initially. Jobs was intense, demanding, and somewhat arrogant. He told Valentine that Apple was going to change the world and make them all rich. Valentine was not impressed with Jobs' presentation or his personality. But he was impressed with something else. The product itself was genuinely interesting. Wozniak had designed an elegant, functional computer that was far better than anything else available to consumers at the time. Valentine saw the missionary intensity he looked for in founders. Jobs was completely obsessed with bringing computers to normal people. This wasn't about money or fame for him. It was a calling. He believed with absolute conviction that personal computers would transform society and empower individuals. That intensity couldn't be faked. It was either genuine or it wasn't. With Jobs, it was completely genuine. But Valentine also saw that Jobs was too young and inexperienced to build a company without help. What Jobs and Wozniak needed was professional management to complement their vision and technical capability. Valentine told Jobs he would consider investing if Jobs could recruit an experienced business person to join the company as chairman and provide adult supervision. Jobs eventually recruited Mike Markula, a retired Intel executive, to join Apple as chairman and investor. Markula invested his own money and brought operational expertise that Jobs and Wozniak lacked. With Markula on board, Valentine agreed to invest. In January 1978, Sequoia invested $150,000 in Apple Computer for 10% of the company. This investment would transform Sequoia's reputation and Valentine's career. Apple grew explosively, shipping the Apple II computer that became the breakthrough product defining the personal computer industry. The company went public in December 1980 at a valuation of $1.8 billion. Sequoia's initial $150,000 investment was now worth $17.6 million, a more than 100-fold return in less than 3 years. But the Apple investment was significant for reasons beyond the financial returns. It established several principles that would guide Valentine's career for decades. First, the quality of the founding team mattered more than anything else. Jobs and Wozniak had the vision, technical capability, and intensity needed to build something exceptional. Second, great products in large markets would find their business models. Apple didn't have a fully developed business plan when Valentine invested. They had a breakthrough product and a massive market opportunity. Third, the best investments often looked wrong initially to most investors. Jobs was young, inexperienced, and unconventional. Most serious venture capitalists passed on Apple because the founder didn't fit their template. Valentine saw past superficial factors to the underlying capability and opportunity. Fourth, patience and support mattered. Helping Jobs recruit Marcula showed that Valentine was willing to help companies solve problems rather than just writing checks and waiting for outcomes. The Apple investment made Valentine famous in Silicon Valley. Entrepreneurs wanted Sequoia's money and Valentine's guidance. Other venture capitalists started copying his approach, focusing more on founders and less on business plans. Limited partners wanted to invest in Sequoia's funds. In a few years, Valentine had established Sequoia as one of the most successful and respected venture firms in the industry. But Valentine didn't rest on his success with Apple. He immediately started looking for the next great opportunity. In 1979, he met Jerry Sanders, the flamboyant founder of Advanced Micro Devices, which became one of Intel's major competitors in microprocessors. Valentine invested in AMD and joined the board, helping Sanders build the company into a semiconductor powerhouse. In 1980, Valentine invested in a company called Electronic Arts, which would become the largest video game publisher in the world. The founder, Trip Hawkins, had worked at Apple and understood how personal computers would enable new forms of entertainment. Valentine saw that video games could be a massive market as computers became more powerful and graphics improved. Most investors thought video games were toys. Valentine thought they were the future of interactive entertainment. In 1982, Valentine made what would become his second most famous investment after Apple. He met two Stanford graduate students, Sandy Lerner and Leonard Bosack, who had invented a device called a router that could connect different computer networks together. They called their company Cisco Systems. They were selling routers out of their garage to Stanford and other universities that were building early computer networks. Most venture capitalists didn't understand what routers were or why they mattered. The market for networking equipment was tiny. The technology was complex and unproven. Lerner and Bosack were academics, not experienced business people. The company had no revenue model or business plan. By conventional investment standards, Cisco looked like a terrible opportunity. But Valentine saw something different. He understood that as computers proliferated, they would need to communicate with each other. Networking would be fundamental infrastructure for the coming information age. Cisco's routers solved a real problem that would only get bigger as more organizations deployed computers. The technology worked and had genuine advantages over alternatives. And Lerner and Bosack had the technical capability to keep improving their products. Valentine invested $2.5 million in Cisco in 1987 at a $15 million pre-money valuation. This was a substantial investment by Sequoia's standards at the time. Valentine took a board seat and immediately went to work helping Cisco build a real company. He recruited John Morgridge, an experienced executive from Honeywell, to become CEO and provide professional management. He helped Cisco develop a sales organization to expand beyond academic customers. He guided strategy and decision-making as the company grew. Cisco grew explosively as the networking market developed exactly as Valentine had predicted. More companies needed to connect computers together. The internet was beginning to emerge as a commercial infrastructure. Data networking became essential for every organization. Cisco dominated this market with superior technology and execution. The company went public in February 1990 at a valuation of $224 million. Valentine's investment had increased 15-fold in just 3 years. But that was just the beginning. Cisco continued growing as networking became fundamental to the emerging internet economy. By the late 1990s, Cisco was one of the most valuable companies in the world, worth more than $500 billion at its peak. Sequoia's initial $2.5 million investment eventually generated returns exceeding $4 billion. This was one of the most successful venture capital investments in history. The Cisco investment showcased Valentine's pattern recognition at its best. He had identified a founder team with genuine technical capability in Leone and Bosack. He had seen a market opportunity before it was obvious to others. He had been willing to invest before business metrics justified the valuation. He had helped recruit professional management to complement the founder's strengths. And he had been patient as the market developed and the company scaled. This was his system working perfectly. By the early 1990s, Valentine had established himself as the most successful technology investor in venture capital history. Sequoia had backed Apple, Cisco, Oracle, Electronic Arts, LSI Logic, and dozens of other companies that defined the personal computer and networking revolutions. Valentine's track record was unmatched. His reputation attracted the best entrepreneurs and the most sophisticated limited partners. Sequoia had become the gold standard for technology venture capital. But Valentine was also evolving as an investor and firm builder. In the early days, Sequoia had been essentially Valentine's personal investment vehicle. He made all the decisions, led all the investments, and dominated all the relationships. This worked when the firm was small and the industry was young. But as Sequoia grew and the venture capital industry matured, Valentine realized he needed to build an institution that could outlive him and continue succeeding after he retired. In 1988, Valentine recruited Michael Moritz to join Sequoia as a partner. Moritz had been a journalist at Time magazine covering the technology industry. He had written a book about Apple and understood Silicon Valley deeply. Valentine saw in Moritz the same pattern recognition capability and systematic thinking that had made Valentine successful. Moritz would eventually become one of the greatest venture investors of his generation, backing companies like Google, Yahoo, PayPal, and LinkedIn. Valentine also recruited Doug Leone, who had been an entrepreneur and technology executive. Leone brought operational experience and an aggressive investment style that complemented Moritz's more analytical approach. Together, Moritz and Leone would lead Sequoia for decades after Valentine stepped back from day-to-day involvement. Building this next generation of leadership was perhaps Valentine's most important contribution to Sequoia's long-term success. Many venture firms struggle to maintain performance after their founding partners retire. The personal relationships, pattern recognition, and judgment that made the founders successful are difficult to transfer to new partners. But Valentine was systematic about developing talent and passing on the frameworks and principles that had made him successful. Valentine taught his partners to focus on the quality of the founding team above all else. To look for missionary intensity and genuine capability. To think about markets that didn't exist yet rather than competing in established industries. To be patient and supportive with companies rather than purely financial. To maintain high standards and pass on opportunities that didn't meet those standards. These principles became embedded in Sequoia's culture and approach. In the mid-1990s, Valentine began stepping back from active investing. He remained chairman of Sequoia and continued serving on boards of portfolio companies, but Moritz and Leone took over responsibility for new investments and fundraising. Valentine was now in his 60s and had proven everything there was to prove in venture capital. He had generated extraordinary returns for his limited partners, helped build dozens of successful companies, and created an institution that would continue long after him. But Valentine's pattern recognition would be tested one more time in the most important investment of his career. In 1999, at the height of the dot-com bubble, two Stanford PhD students came to Sequoia looking for funding. Their names were Larry Page and Sergey Brin. They had built a search engine called Google. They had no revenue. They had no business model. They had no idea how to make money. The market looked saturated with established competitors. Every conventional metric suggested this was a terrible investment. Valentine took the meeting because he had always made time for Stanford founders. He listened to Page and Brin explain their technology. They had developed an algorithm called PageRank that analyzed the link structure of the web to determine which pages were most authoritative and relevant. Their search results were dramatically better than anything else available. The technology was genuinely differentiated. But that wasn't what convinced Valentine to invest. What convinced him was seeing the same missionary intensity in Page and Brin that he had seen in Steve Jobs 20 years earlier. These were not opportunistic entrepreneurs chasing a business opportunity. They were academic researchers obsessed with organizing the world's information. They cared about the product far more than they cared about money or business. That intensity was unmistakable. Valentine also saw that Page and Brin were exceptional technologists. They had built something 10 times better than the competition. The user experience was vastly superior. The technology was scalable and defensible. And the market opportunity was enormous. Every person with internet access needed to find information. Search was fundamental infrastructure for the emerging internet economy. Most importantly, Valentine had seen this pattern before. A breakthrough product in a market that everyone thought was solved. Founders with missionary intensity and technical brilliance. A technology so much better than alternatives that it would win despite having no business model yet. Apple had followed this pattern in personal computers. Cisco had followed it in networking. Google would follow it in search. The business model would come eventually. Great products in huge markets always figured out how to monetize. The key was not to force a business model prematurely if it would compromise the product quality. Page and Brin wanted to keep search results pure and unbiased. They didn't want advertising cluttering the interface. Valentine supported this approach because he believed product quality would win. In June 1999, Sequoia invested $12.5 million in Google at a $250 million valuation. This was one of the largest venture investments Sequoia had ever made. Valentine was betting big on Page and Brin the same way he had bet big on Jobs and Wozniak decades earlier. The investment was controversial inside Sequoia. Some partners thought the valuation was too high and the market too crowded. But Valentine pushed it through based on his conviction about the team and technology. Google grew even faster than Apple or Cisco had. The product was so much better than competitors that users switched immediately. Traffic exploded. By the time Google figured out its advertising business model a few years later, it dominated search globally. The company went public in August 2004 at a valuation of $23 billion. Sequoia's $12.5 million investment was now worth $1.3 billion, more than a 100-fold return in 5 years. But the ultimate value would be much larger. Google continued growing and became one of the most valuable companies in history, worth more than $1 trillion at its peak. Sequoia held some of its Google shares after the IPO and the total returns exceeded $4 billion. Combined with Cisco, these two investments alone had generated more than $8 billion for Sequoia's limited partners. This was unprecedented success in venture capital. The Google investment was the capstone to Valentine's career. It proved that his approach to pattern recognition and founder evaluation worked across different technology waves and market cycles. He had backed the defining companies of the personal computer era with Apple, the networking era with Cisco, the internet era with Google. Each time, he had seen patterns that others missed. Each time, he had backed founders that others rejected. Each time, he had been spectacularly right. Valentine fully retired from Sequoia in 2006. He had spent 34 years building the firm from nothing to the most successful venture capital franchise in history. Under his leadership, Sequoia had invested in hundreds of companies, backed dozens that went public or were acquired, and generated more than $10 billion in returns for limited partners. The firm managed billions in capital and had become the most sought-after venture investor in Silicon Valley. But Valentine's legacy extended far beyond the financial returns. He had established principles and practices that shaped how venture capital worked. The focus on founding teams over business plans. The willingness to invest in markets that didn't exist yet. The importance of operational support and not just capital. The value of concentration and conviction over diversification. The need for patience and long-term orientation. These ideas, which seemed obvious in retrospect, were radical when Valentine first implemented them. Valentine had also trained the next generation of venture capitalists who would continue his approach. Michael Moritz and Doug Leone led Sequoia for 2 decades after Valentine retired, backing companies like YouTube, Instagram, WhatsApp, Airbnb, and Stripe. They taught their principles to the generation after them. Today, Sequoia remains one of the most successful venture firms in the world, still following the frameworks that Valentine established 50 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, Valentine had proven that venture capital could be systematic rather than random. That pattern recognition could be developed and refined. That judgment about founders and markets could be trained through experience and observation. That investing success wasn't about luck or connections but about rigorous thinking and disciplined execution. He had turned venture capital from an art into a science, or at least a systematic craft that could be learned and practiced. Valentine's approach to evaluating founders became legendary in Silicon Valley. He developed a framework he called the Founder's Test that consisted of several key questions. First, why is this person uniquely qualified to build this company? What have they already accomplished that demonstrates exceptional capability? Second, are they missionaries or mercenaries? Are they obsessed with solving a problem or just chasing a business opportunity? Third, can they articulate their vision clearly and compellingly? Great founders can explain complex ideas simply. Fourth, can they attract and manage talented people? Building companies requires assembling teams. Valentine believed you could assess these qualities through careful observation and questioning. He would ask founders about their backgrounds, their motivations, their previous accomplishments, and their thinking process. He would watch how they responded to challenging questions. Whether they got defensive or engaged intellectually. Whether they admitted what they didn't know or pretended to have all the answers. Whether they listened and incorporated feedback or ignored input that contradicted their views. He also developed frameworks for evaluating markets and technologies. He asked whether the technology was genuinely differentiated or just incrementally better. Whether the market opportunity was large enough to support a significant company. Whether customers would pay for the solution or just find it interesting. Whether the competitive dynamics favored new entrants or incumbents. Whether the timing was right or too early or too late. But Valentine's greatest insight was understanding that these frameworks were tools for thinking, not formulas for decision-making. Every investment required judgment about people and situations that couldn't be reduced to checklists or algorithms. The frameworks helped organize thinking and identify key questions, but ultimately Valentine trusted his instincts developed over decades of experience. He had seen enough founders and companies to recognize patterns that others missed. One pattern Valentine identified was the importance of what he called forcing functions in markets. These were external factors that compelled customers to adopt new technologies or solutions regardless of incumbent advantages. The personal computer became a forcing function for businesses that needed to improve productivity. Networking became a forcing function as organizations deployed more computers that needed to communicate. The internet became a forcing function for every aspect of commerce and communication. Valentine looked for companies positioned to benefit from these forcing functions. Technologies that solved problems customers couldn't ignore. Solutions that became more valuable as adoption increased. Markets where network effects or switching costs would create winner-take-all dynamics. He wanted to invest in companies that could ride powerful secular trends rather than fighting against market headwinds. Another pattern Valentine recognized was the importance of timing in technology investing. Too early was the same as being wrong. Many venture investors had backed companies with great technology that failed because the market wasn't ready yet. Infrastructure wasn't in place. Costs were too high. Customer behavior hadn't changed. Being right about the future didn't matter if you ran out of money before the future arrived. Valentine was skilled at assessing whether timing was right for new technologies and markets. He looked at infrastructure development, cost curves for critical components, customer behavior trends, competitive dynamics, regulatory environment. He wanted to invest when multiple factors were aligning to create sustainable market momentum, not when everything was still speculative and uncertain. This timing judgment was crucial for Valentine's success with Apple, Cisco, and Google. Each investment came at the moment when enabling technologies, customer needs, and market conditions were converging to create explosive growth. Valentine didn't invest in personal computers before Apple or networking before Cisco or search before Google. He waited until the moment was right, then backed the best teams addressing those opportunities. Valentine was also exceptional at helping companies after he invested. Many venture capitalists see their role as purely financial, providing capital and then waiting for outcomes. Valentine saw investing as the beginning of a partnership where he could help companies succeed through advice, connections, and operational support. He spent significant time with portfolio companies, particularly in early stages when guidance mattered most. One way Valentine helped was recruiting executive talent. He had spent decades building relationships throughout the technology industry. He knew who the best executives were in sales, engineering, operations, and finance. When portfolio companies needed to upgrade their teams, Valentine could make introductions and help close candidates. His endorsement carried weight because of his track record and reputation. Valentine also helped with strategic decisions about product direction, market positioning, and business model. He had seen dozens of companies navigate similar choices. He understood which strategies tended to work and which failed. He could provide perspective that founders lacked because of limited experience. He asked challenging questions that forced founders to think more rigorously about their assumptions and plans. Perhaps most importantly, Valentine provided emotional support and encouragement during difficult periods. Building companies is psychologically demanding. Founders face constant setbacks, uncertainties, and pressures. Having an investor who believed in them and had confidence in their ability to overcome obstacles made a meaningful difference. Valentine's support wasn't just about money, it was about being a partner who would stick with companies through challenges. But Valentine was also demanding and held founders accountable. He expected exceptional performance and didn't tolerate excuses or mediocrity. If companies weren't executing well, he would push for changes, including replacing executives or founders if necessary. He believed that being supportive didn't mean accepting poor performance. The best founders wanted investors who challenged them and held high standards. Valentine's board service became legendary for its effectiveness. He served on dozens of boards over his career, helping companies navigate growth challenges, strategic decisions, and crisis situations. He was known for asking penetrating questions that got to the heart of issues. For cutting through complexity to identify the critical factors that mattered. For providing clear, actionable guidance rather than vague advice. Other board members and executives learned from watching Valentine operate. He prepared thoroughly for board meetings, reading materials carefully and coming with specific questions. He listened more than he talked, letting management present their views before offering his perspective. He focused on the most important strategic issues rather than getting lost in operational details. He was direct and honest, never playing political games or sugarcoating bad news. Valentine's reputation for board effectiveness made companies want him as an investor and board member. Founders knew he would add value beyond capital. Limited partners knew he would protect their interests and help companies succeed. Other board members knew he would elevate the quality of governance and decision-making. This reputation became a competitive advantage for Sequoia, helping the firm win deals against other venture firms. As Valentine transitioned out of active investing in the 2000s, he spent more time mentoring younger venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. He taught classes at Stanford Business School, sharing frameworks and lessons from his career. He advised the next generation of Sequoia partners on deal evaluation and company building. He spoke at industry events about the evolution of technology and venture capital. He remained engaged with the ecosystem he had helped create. One theme Valentine emphasized in his teaching was the importance of discipline in venture investing. The best opportunities were rare. Most companies failed or generated mediocre returns. The key to success was being highly selective, only investing in exceptional teams addressing large market opportunities with differentiated solutions. This required the discipline to pass on hundreds of opportunities to find the few worth backing. Valentine contrasted this concentrated, selective approach with the spray and pray strategy that many venture firms practiced. Some investors made dozens or hundreds of small investments, hoping that a few big winners would offset many failures. Valentine believed this approach rarely generated exceptional returns because it diluted attention and capital across too many companies. Better to make fewer, larger investments in the best opportunities and support those companies intensively. This concentration strategy required conviction and courage. You had to be willing to look wrong when deals you passed on succeeded. You had to resist pressure to invest just to deploy capital or maintain deal flow. You had to trust your judgment even when others disagreed. But Valentine's track record proved this approach worked. His best investments generated enormous returns that made everything else irrelevant. Valentine also emphasized the importance of intellectual honesty in evaluating investments. It was easy to fall in love with companies or founders and rationalize weak points in an opportunity. It was tempting to follow consensus and invest in hot deals everyone wanted. It was comfortable to rely on heuristics and pattern matching rather than rigorous analysis. But great investing required relentlessly questioning your own assumptions and biases. Valentine taught investors to actively look for reasons not to invest. What could go wrong? What are we missing? What are the strongest arguments against this opportunity? How might we be fooling ourselves? This adversarial approach to investment analysis helped avoid the confirmation bias that led many investors astray. It forced deeper thinking about risks and uncertainties that superficial analysis missed. Another principle Valentine emphasized was the importance of learning from both successes and failures. Many investors only studied their winning investments, trying to identify patterns to replicate. But Valentine believed you learned more from failures and near misses. Why did certain companies fail despite seeming promising? What warning signs were missed? What assumptions proved wrong? Understanding failure patterns was just as important as understanding success patterns. Valentine maintained detailed records of his investment decisions, including notes on why he invested in certain companies and passed on others. He would review these periodically to assess his judgment and identify patterns in his thinking. This systematic approach to learning from experience helped Valentine refine his frameworks and improve his decision-making over decades. As Valentine reflected on his career in later years, he emphasized several lessons that went beyond specific investment frameworks. First, success in venture capital required genuine intellectual curiosity about technology and markets. You had to find the work intrinsically interesting, not just view it as a way to make money. The best investors were the ones who would study new technologies and markets even if they weren't investing, just because they found them fascinating. Second, building relationships and reputation mattered as much as investment skill. Venture capital was ultimately a relationship business where trust and credibility determined access to the best opportunities. Entrepreneurs chose which investors they wanted to work with. The best founders had many options and selected partners based on reputation and relationships. Building that trust took years of consistent behavior and adding value to portfolio companies. Third, patience was essential for generating exceptional returns. The best investments took years or even decades to fully compound. Pressure to show quick returns led investors to sell winning positions too early or force premature exits. Valentine's biggest successes came from companies he held for many years, sometimes more than a decade. This required conviction and the ability to resist pressure from limited partners who wanted to see distributions. Fourth, adaptability was necessary to succeed across different technology cycles and market conditions. The venture capital industry changed dramatically during Valentine's career. Technologies evolved. Market dynamics shifted. Competition intensified. Investment strategies that worked in one era might not work in the next. The best investors continuously learned and adapted while maintaining core principles. Fifth, building an institution that could outlast the founder was the ultimate achievement. Many successful investors struggled to transfer their judgment and relationships to the next generation. Their firms declined after they retired because the magic couldn't be replicated. Valentine viewed building Sequoia as his greatest accomplishment, creating a firm that continued generating exceptional returns decades after he stepped back from active investing. Valentine's influence on Silicon Valley extended beyond his direct investments and the success of Sequoia. He helped establish many of the norms and practices that define how the technology industry operates. The focus on founder-led companies rather than professional managers. The acceptance of failure as part of the innovation process. The emphasis on product quality and customer value over short-term profits. The willingness to fund technologies and markets that didn't exist yet. Valentine was also influential in developing the venture capital partnership model that became standard in the industry. Before Sequoia and a few other early firms, most venture capital was done by individuals or loosely organized groups. Valentine helped establish practices like fund structures, limited partner agreements, management fees, and carried interest calculations that became industry standards. He showed that venture capital could be a systematic, professional business rather than just wealthy individuals making personal investments. The network effects from Valentine's investments were enormous. Apple, Cisco, Oracle, Electronic Arts, and Google directly created hundreds of thousands of jobs. They generated hundreds of billions in economic value. They enabled entirely new industries and ways of working. But the second-order effects were even larger. These companies trained entrepreneurs and executives who went on to start or lead hundreds of other companies. They created wealth that was reinvested in new ventures. They demonstrated what was possible with technology and entrepreneurship. The PayPal Mafia is the most famous example of this alumni network effect, but Apple, Cisco, and Google created similar networks. Executives and early employees from these companies started their own ventures, funded by Sequoia and other firms. They applied lessons learned at their previous companies to new opportunities. They hired people they had worked with before. The compounding effects of these networks accelerated innovation and company creation throughout Silicon Valley. Valentine understood these network dynamics and consciously tried to strengthen them. He introduced founders from different portfolio companies to each other. He facilitated partnerships and business development relationships. He helped connect companies with customers, suppliers, and potential acquirers. He viewed Sequoia's portfolio as an ecosystem where companies could help each other succeed, not just independent investments. This ecosystem approach created additional value for portfolio companies beyond Sequoia's capital and guidance. A founder backed by Sequoia gained access to a network of other founders, executives, experts, and potential partners. This network became increasingly valuable as Sequoia's portfolio grew and more successful companies emerged from the firm. Being part of the Sequoia ecosystem became a significant competitive advantage for startups. Valentine's investment philosophy evolved somewhat over his career as markets and technologies changed. In the early days, he focused heavily on semiconductor and hardware companies because that was where he had expertise and relationships. As software became more important in the 1980s and 90s, Valentine adapted his framework to evaluate software businesses. When the Internet emerged, he learned to assess Internet companies and business models. But while the specific technologies and markets changed, Valentine's core principles remained constant. Focus on exceptional founding teams. Look for missionary intensity and genuine capability. Invest in differentiated technology addressing large market opportunities. Be patient and supportive as companies scale. Maintain high standards and discipline in deal selection. These principles worked across different technology waves because they were fundamentally about human judgment and market dynamics rather than specific technologies. Valentine was sometimes criticized for being too focused on consumer and enterprise technology at the expense of other sectors like healthcare, energy, or financial services. Some investors argued that Sequoia was missing opportunities in important industries that were also being transformed by technology. Valentine's response was that it was better to focus deeply on areas where you had genuine expertise and relationships rather than spreading into sectors you didn't understand well. This focus was a key source of Sequoia's competitive advantage. Valentine and his partners knew the technology industry intimately. They understood product development cycles, go-to-market strategies, competitive dynamics, and exit opportunities. They had relationships with potential customers, partners, and acquirers. They could evaluate technical claims and assess engineering teams. This depth of expertise in a specific domain was more valuable than superficial knowledge across many sectors. Valentine was also criticized at times for being too aggressive in board meetings and pushing founders too hard. Some entrepreneurs found his direct style intimidating or discouraging. They wanted investors who were more supportive and less challenging. Valentine's view was that his job was to help companies succeed, not to make founders comfortable. Great founders wanted and needed investors who would challenge their thinking and hold them accountable. The entrepreneurs who worked best with Valentine appreciated his honesty and high standards. They recognized that he was demanding because he cared about their success and wanted them to reach their full potential. They valued having an investor who would tell them hard truths rather than flattering them or avoiding difficult conversations. The best founder-investor relationships were based on mutual respect and trust, not just friendship. Valentine's personal life was much less public than his professional achievements. He married his wife Petra in the early 1960s and they remained together for more than 50 years until his death. They had 3 children and lived in Woodside, California, a wealthy community near Stanford and the venture capital firms on Sand Hill Road. Valentine was notoriously private about his personal life and rarely discussed his family in interviews or public appearances. Outside of venture capital, Valentine's primary passion was thoroughbred horse racing. He owned and bred racing horses for decades, maintaining a farm in Kentucky where some of the finest race horses in America were raised. This hobby was expensive and rarely profitable, but Valentine loved the competition, the strategy of breeding decisions, and the thrill of watching his horses compete. The pattern recognition skills that made him a great investor also served him well in evaluating bloodlines and racing potential. Valentine was also a significant philanthropist, though he approached charitable giving with the same systematic thinking he applied to investing. He focused his philanthropy primarily on education, particularly supporting Stanford University and programs that trained entrepreneurs and engineers. He believed that investing in human capital through education created more lasting impact than most other forms of charity. Valentine established the Don Valentine Fund at Stanford Graduate School of Business, supporting entrepreneurship programs and research on venture capital and innovation. He funded scholarships for engineering students and supported programs that connected academic research with commercial applications. His philanthropy reflected his belief that entrepreneurship and technology innovation were the most powerful drivers of economic growth and social progress. In his later years, Valentine became more reflective about his career and legacy. He gave occasional interviews and speeches where he shared lessons learned and perspectives on how venture capital and Silicon Valley had evolved. He was proud of Sequoia's success and the companies he had helped build, but he was also realistic about the role of luck and timing in his outcomes. Valentine acknowledged that he had been in the right place at the right time repeatedly throughout his career. He entered the semiconductor industry just as it was taking off. He started Sequoia just as the personal computer revolution was beginning. He invested in networking just as the internet was emerging. He backed search just as the web was becoming the dominant information platform. These were fortunate coincidences, not just brilliant foresight. But Valentine also emphasized that luck favors the prepared mind. He had positioned himself to recognize and capitalize on these opportunities because of decades spent building expertise, relationships, and judgment. He worked harder than most investors to understand technologies and markets. He maintained higher standards for investment selection. He was more patient and supportive with portfolio companies. The luck was real, but the preparation and execution mattered enormously. As Valentine aged, he watched the venture capital industry transform in ways that concerned him. The amount of capital flowing into venture funds exploded from millions in his early days to hundreds of billions by the 2000s and 2010s. More firms were competing for deals, driving valuations higher and returns lower. The average quality of investors declined as people with limited operating experience raised large funds based on 1 or 2 lucky investments. Valentine worried that the industry was losing its discipline and focus on fundamentals. Too many investors were making decisions based on hype and momentum rather than rigorous analysis of teams and markets. Too much capital was chasing too few great opportunities, leading to inflated valuations that would eventually crash. Too many founders were being funded who lacked the capability or commitment to build lasting companies. He was particularly concerned about the shortening time horizons in venture capital. More investors wanted quick flips and fast exits rather than patiently building companies over many years. The pressure to show returns to limited partners led to premature exits and growth-at-all-costs strategies that often destroyed value. The best companies took time to mature and compound value, but fewer investors seemed willing to be that patient. Valentine also worried about the changing relationship between investors and founders. In earlier eras, there was more mutual respect and collaboration. Investors added value through operational support and strategic guidance. Founders appreciated having experienced partners who could help them navigate challenges. But as capital became abundant and founders gained more leverage, some founders viewed investors as purely transactional capital providers rather than partners. Despite these concerns, Valentine remained optimistic about technology innovation and entrepreneurship. He believed that talented, ambitious people would continue building companies that created enormous value regardless of market cycles or industry dynamics. The fundamental drivers of innovation, the desire to solve problems, build better products, and create something lasting, remained as powerful as ever. Valentine's health declined in his later years, though he remained intellectually engaged with Sequoia and the technology industry until near the end of his life. He continued attending board meetings for companies where he was a director. He advised Sequoia partners on major investment decisions. He mentored young entrepreneurs who sought his counsel. Even in his 80s, his pattern recognition and judgment remained sharp. Don Valentine died on October 25, 2019, at the age of 87. His death marked the end of an era in Silicon Valley. He had been present at the creation of the modern technology industry and venture capital. He had helped build many of the most important companies of the past 50 years. He had trained multiple generations of investors and entrepreneurs. His influence on how technology companies are funded and built was immeasurable. The tributes that followed Valentine's death reflected his enormous impact on Silicon Valley. Entrepreneurs and executives from companies across multiple decades shared stories of how Valentine had helped them, challenged them, and believed in them when others didn't. Fellow investors acknowledged him as the gold standard, the venture capitalist whose judgment, discipline, and support set the example everyone else tried to follow. Sequoia Capital continued thriving after Valentine's death, still following many of the principles and practices he had established. The firm remained one of the most successful venture investors in the world, backing companies like Zoom, DoorDash, Snowflake, and dozens of other major successes. The focus on founder quality, market size, and patient capital that Valentine had championed remained central to Sequoia's approach. Valentine's legacy can be measured in several dimensions. First, the direct financial returns he generated were extraordinary. His investments created hundreds of billions of dollars in value for limited partners, portfolio companies, employees, and shareholders. This wealth funded philanthropy, subsequent investments, and economic activity that continued compounding long after his death. Second, the companies Valentine helped build transformed entire industries and changed how people work, communicate, and live. Apple made personal computing accessible to everyone. Cisco enabled the internet infrastructure that connected the world. Google organized information and made knowledge universally accessible. Electronic Arts created the video game industry as entertainment. These impacts extended far beyond financial returns to fundamental changes in human society. Third, Valentine established practices and principles that shaped how venture capital operates. The focus on teams over business plans. The willingness to invest before markets exist. The importance of operational support beyond capital. The value of concentration and conviction. These ideas seem obvious now, but they were revolutionary when Valentine first implemented them. Every venture investor today operates in frameworks that Valentine helped create. Fourth, Valentine trained and influenced generations of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs who carried his lessons forward. The partners he recruited and mentored at Sequoia became legendary investors in their own right. The founders he backed started new companies and funded other entrepreneurs. The network effects from Valentine's career cascaded through Silicon Valley for decades, enabling innovation and company creation far beyond his direct investments. Fifth, Valentine demonstrated that venture capital could be systematic and disciplined rather than random or relationship-driven. he proved that pattern recognition could be developed through experience and observation. That judgment about founders and markets could be refined through rigorous analysis and honest self-assessment. He turned venture investing from an art into a craft that could be taught and practiced. The lessons from Valentine's career remain relevant for contemporary investors and entrepreneurs. The importance of focusing on exceptional teams rather than clever business plans. The value of patience and long-term orientation in a world obsessed with quarterly results. The need for discipline in deal selection when capital is abundant and valuations are high. The power of genuine expertise in specific domains rather than superficial knowledge across many sectors. Valentine's story also illustrates the role of timing and luck in success. He entered the semiconductor industry just as it was taking off. He started Sequoia just as multiple technology revolutions were beginning. He invested in the right companies at the right moments repeatedly. This wasn't pure chance, but it wasn't pure skill either. The intersection of preparation and opportunity created his extraordinary outcomes. Perhaps the most important lesson from Valentine's career is that building something that lasts matters more than short-term success. Valentine could have taken his early returns from Apple and Cisco and simply enjoyed his wealth. Instead, he spent decades building Sequoia into an institution that would continue long after him. He trained partners who would carry forward his principles. He established practices that would guide future generations. He created a legacy that transcended his individual achievements. Valentine understood that the ultimate measure of success wasn't the size of his personal fortune or the number of unicorns he backed. It was whether he had helped create the infrastructure, companies, and practices that would enable innovation and entrepreneurship for decades to come. By that measure, his success was extraordinary. Silicon Valley today operates in a world that Valentine helped create. The venture capital industry has changed dramatically since Valentine's early days. The amount of capital available has increased by orders of magnitude. The number of firms and investors has exploded. The geographies where venture capital operates have expanded globally. The sectors receiving funding have diversified beyond technology into every industry. The pace of innovation has accelerated as information spreads instantly worldwide. But the fundamental principles that Valentine established remain as relevant as ever. Great companies are still built by exceptional founders with missionary intensity and genuine capability. Large market opportunities are still created by solving important problems with differentiated solutions. Patient capital that supports companies through inevitable challenges still generates better returns than impatient capital demanding quick exits. Discipline in deal selection still matters more than making many investments and hoping some succeed. Valentine's career spanned the entire history of Silicon Valley as a global center of technology innovation. He worked at Fairchild Semiconductor when the integrated circuit was invented. He invested in Apple when personal computers were toys for hobbyists. He backed Cisco when networking meant connecting a few computers in universities. He funded Google when search seemed sold and boring. Each time, he saw what was coming before others did. This ability to see patterns before they become obvious is the rarest and most valuable skill in investing. It requires deep knowledge of technologies and markets, extensive relationships with entrepreneurs and experts, decades of experience observing what works and what fails, the intellectual honesty to admit what you don't know, the courage to act on conviction when others disagree, and the patience to wait for outcomes that might take many years to materialize. Valentine had all these qualities in unusual combination. His technical background gave him the foundation to understand complex technologies. His operational experience taught him how companies actually functioned. His relationships throughout Silicon Valley provided access to the best opportunities. His pattern recognition skills, refined over decades, allowed him to identify winning founders and markets. And his discipline prevented him from making investments that didn't meet his high standards. The story of Don Valentine is ultimately a story about judgment, discipline, and patience in a world that often rewards the opposite qualities. About maintaining high standards when pressure pushes toward compromising them. About thinking independently when consensus thinking is safer and easier. About building something lasting when short-term success is more immediately rewarding. These qualities never go out of style regardless of how much technology changes or markets evolve. Valentine proved that systematic thinking and rigorous analysis could generate extraordinary returns in venture capital. That you didn't need to be the smartest person or have the best connections to succeed. You needed frameworks for evaluating opportunities, discipline to apply them consistently, and patience to let great investments compound over time. These capabilities could be developed through study, experience, and honest self-reflection. But Valentine's story also shows the limits of systems and frameworks. At the end of every investment decision was a human judgment that couldn't be reduced to algorithms or checklists. Should we back this founding team? Is this market opportunity real? Is the timing right? These questions required weighing incomplete information, assessing probabilities, and making bets despite uncertainty. The frameworks helped organize thinking, but judgment was ultimately irreducible to formulas. This combination of systematic thinking and human judgment is what made Valentine exceptional. He had frameworks and principles that guided his analysis. But he never let the framework substitute for deep thinking about specific situations. Every investment required grappling with unique circumstances, people, and market dynamics. The art was knowing when the patterns applied and when they didn't. When to trust the system and when to trust your instincts. Valentine's legacy lives on not just in the companies he funded or the wealth he created, but in the approach to venture capital that he pioneered and that thousands of investors now follow. Every venture capitalist who focuses on founder quality, who looks for missionary intensity, who thinks about markets that don't exist yet, who maintains discipline in deal selection, is operating in frameworks that Valentine established. The industry he helped create now allocates hundreds of billions of dollars annually using principles he developed. The technology industry Valentine helped build now shapes every aspect of modern life. The computer revolution he funded through Apple put powerful technology in everyone's hands. The networking revolution he enabled through Cisco connected the world digitally. The internet revolution he supported through Google made information universally accessible. These changes fundamentally altered how humans work, communicate, learn, and relate to each other. Whether these changes have been positive on balance is a question beyond the scope of Valentine's story. Technology has created enormous benefits in productivity, access to information, and human connection. But it has also created challenges around privacy, inequality, misinformation, and social fragmentation. Valentine focused on funding innovation and company building, not on managing the broader social implications of technology. History will judge whether that focus was appropriate or insufficient. What cannot be disputed is Valentine's extraordinary impact on the technology industry and venture capital. He was present at the creation. He helped build the infrastructure. He funded the companies. He trained the people. He established the practices. Silicon Valley today is in many ways the world that Don Valentine built. That legacy, for better or worse, will endure for generations to come.